Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Work Item Podcast. And this season is panning out great with some wonderful guests. And today I have Rachel Andrew on the show. Rachel, welcome.
Hi, it's good to be here.
I am very excited to learn about your career because I know you're a prolific web developer. I remember reading some of your content, I believe in Smashing Magazine. Like there's a few, and there's a lot to talk about. But maybe I want to start with where did it all begin? So you had a blog post on your site called 1996, and I won't spoil it for folks. But maybe you can kind of walk us through kind of what were the early days where you realized that web development is the thing for me.
Yeah, so this was not the thing I was intending to do. I trained as a dancer. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in theatre. Theatre was all I knew. I actually left school at 16 to go and do dance with a fairly poor set of what we call GCSEs in the UK, which is the sort of basic qualifications that we get. So yeah, I didn't stay till 18, and I went off to study dance full time. That was what I was going to do. I did 4 years of dance and music theatre college, went down to London. I'm from the northeast of England. I went down to London to work as a dancer. Um, kind of got disillusioned relatively quickly about that industry. And so went backstage because, as I say, theatre was what I knew. And I'd worked as a choreographer, and so I'd done quite a lot of backstage stuff as well. And so went backstage, was working backstage, having a great time working in the West End, like throwing heavy stuff about and working on shows, and got pregnant with my daughter. And there were very few women doing this work anyway, and particularly not pregnant ones. So I found myself very quickly with that job. Um, and one of the things I had learned to do at school in the lessons that I did attend was I'd learned to type. I could touch type. So I thought, well, I'll just take in typing. That's something I could do, you know. And I was going to get a word processor, and there was a chap in the computer store upsold me to a computer. He's like, "You don't want a word processor, you know, a computer, that's the thing." So I got this computer, and that's really where the story started because I was pregnant and I didn't know any other people with babies, and so I got on the internet and started chatting to other mums and mums to be. And at the time, if you wanted to have a web presence at all, there was no Facebook or anything. You built a website. So there we all were building websites and talking about like nappies and and feeding and teething and all of that stuff and swapping HTML tips. And so that was kind of where it started, was that I started learning HTML from parenting forums and then moved on to, you know, webmaster forums as were. I mean, that's what we were, you know, doing everything. And sort of because I was kind of taking all this information, you know, I was asking a lot of questions. I kind of felt, well, I need to give back. So then I started helping the beginners. You know, new people would turn up all the time. So as long as I've been developing for the web, I've been teaching people about the web because I would learn stuff and then I'd teach it to somebody else. And that's really all I've ever done. And so, you know, I've sort of over the years, I've written a lot of books. I've done a lot of, you know, articles, and I'm now a content lead at Google for Chrome. But all of that started by this sort of idea that, oh, I'm learning something from these other people, so I'd like to then give back and help some other people out, you know, and that's what I've always done.
That is a lovely story, and especially how kind of serendipitous the transition was from I want a word processor to actually learning HTML. What were the tools that you used first? Because I remember when I first experienced building my own website, it was more than 2 decades ago. And I think it was Front Page at the time. What was yours?
Well, it was really just I was in Notepad because I was even before any of those kind of visual tools. So I just learned HTML and mostly learned from viewing source. I mean, I can remember very clearly seeing my first image rollover with JavaScript and being like, "Wow, what magic is this?" You know, and so I was just learning, and I didn't really think of anything as programming. I mean, I was a pretty good Perl programmer before I kind of even thought of that as programming. You know, I was just learning. I wanted to do a guest book. How do you do a guest book? At the time, you learned Perl. You wrote a CGI script, and so that was just the next step. You know, so for a long time, I was basically a back end web developer. So I went from Perl to, well, actually through Classic ASP briefly, to PHP. And so for a long time, I was a PHP developer. And all of that was, I say it took a long time before I realized that's what I was doing, because I'd never seen myself as technical. And I'm actually, I thought design, because I've got an arts background, but I'm actually an absolutely shocking designer. I'm a pretty decent programmer, and sort of and web developer. So that's kind of where it went. And yeah, so I just kind of learned the next thing, and then, as I say, constantly teaching this stuff to other people, because it seemed like, oh, I figured out an interesting thing. Maybe someone would like to know.
And what folks don't realize is also, it kind of reminds me that back when, kind of in the infancy days of a lot of the PHP, ASP Classic, the resources that we have today did not exist. Like there was no Stack Overflow. There was no, forum where you can go and all these people are storming in. It's like, it's still a very much a, I want to call it like a half exclusive club where there's folks that are building websites, and then you kind of have to learn your own. And it sounds like that's what you did. You had a scenario in mind where you're like, okay, I want something like a guest book, and like I'm going to go and figure out how to build this because that's a necessity.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously, I've got no sort of formal computer science background, and even today, I work at Google, and and I'm on the CSS Working Group and things, and I hang out with people who have got that very formal background. And sometimes I'll be in a working group meeting and everyone's talking about some algorithm or something, and they're using a word, and I'm just like, what's that? And I go and I look it up, or I'll get someone to tell me, and I'll realize that I actually understand the concept. I just don't have the words for it because it's not something I ever learned. And so I'd learned, I mean, say recursion or something like that. It took me a long time to realize that was a thing. That it was just that, oh, well, I just worked out that's what I needed to do. And so um, it's funny, and I think that's part of why I've sort of I enjoy writing about this stuff, because it forces me then to look up, oh, what is that actually called? What's that thing? What are we doing there? So,
What I find interesting about what you just said is also the concept of this kind of formal degree is such an interesting, I want to say, like gatekeeping tactic in our industry oftentimes, where folks see it as like, oh, you have to have a degree to be successful. And you're proving through years of experience that this is not actually true. Like you can learn a lot from your own experience. You can learn a lot by carving kind of your own path, even though you don't have kind of the formal credential, if you will. Like that should not stop folks from aspiring to be part of the industry.
no, definitely not. And I think what people who have those degrees have is they often have shortcuts. Some of these things that I took ages to work out. If someone could have said to me, "No, this is what you're doing," and there's something that, and so a lot of these things are, it's useful to know because we can pass on knowledge to each other. And but there wasn't anything. I couldn't have actually learned web development at college at the time I learned web development, because it didn't exist as a discipline. Um, but yeah, I think it's definitely not the only way. I think it is one way, and there's definitely things that I've missed out on by not having a formal training, and I've had to go and find those things out. And it does sometimes make me feel, a bit stupid when people are talking about things, and I'm like, I have no idea what that is. But I mean, I've just got to, and I think it's a bit of privilege, because obviously the position I'm in now, if I ask someone what seems to be what is a basic question, they're just going to tell me. They're not going to think, oh, you're stupid, or you're a beginner, or they're just going to realize it's something I don't know. I think if you are earlier on in your career, it can be a bit frightening to ask those questions of people, because you don't want to look like you don't know something everyone knows. So I think it is worth asking the questions, but I can understand why it is a lot easier for me to ask the questions than it is for someone else, because I've already got this track record that lets me occasionally seem like I don't know what I'm doing.
I mean, I still struggle with imposter syndrome from time to time, and it's I don't think it ever stops. I don't think it ever goes away. Like every time I jump in a meeting sometimes, or it's a meetup, you run into folks that are like inherently smarter than me, and I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but this sounds great. This sounds cool. Like, yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, yeah, it's and I mean, we're quite lucky. We're in an industry where you can always be learning. I'm learning Python at the moment. I never did Python. It's just a language that I seem to manage to completely avoid. But it's probably the most useful language for the sort of things that I need to code for now. Now I'm not a working web developer. So I've been learning, and it's wonderful putting yourself back into being a beginner again, and be like, oh, how, because syntax is, you can learn the syntax easily, that's fine, but it's how that world works is fascinating, and like coming from PHP to Python, you're like, oh, this is really cool. I've not seen that, and then other things that I miss, I'm like, oh, and so I think it's fun, the fact we've got this ability to keep on learning new things and playing with new things and figuring stuff out.
I love that perspective. And you mentioned shortcuts. And speaking of shortcuts to Google, you took a arguably an unconventional one because you mentioned like self-employed for 20 years before
Yes.
coming to Google, right?
Yep.
And for folks listening to this, our audience are folks usually like in mid-career, starting their career, and there's kind of that aspiration, like out of school, right to Google, out of school to one of the FANG companies. Walk me through maybe your motivation for going kind of your own way for quite some time before you decided that, you know what, okay, it's time for Google.
Yeah, so I did. So I sort of did a bit of freelance work when I first started doing this. I was building websites for people, and then I got a job in a .com company. So just as .com companies were kind of collapsing. So it was just 2000. Sort of 1999 I started, and then it sort of into 2000. And yes, I worked for two different kind of .com companies, and just saw how unstable they were. And I was kind of doing quite well as a sort of webmaster. I was doing kind of everything. I was doing everything from servers and to, writing HTML to a bit of management, all sorts of things. And um, yeah, I kind of realized this was not stable. And I thought, I could probably just do better myself. I was seeing, like, friends of mine were turning up to work and finding that the business had basically just gone. They were in a serviced office, the door was locked. And I'm like, I think I can probably do better on my own. And I'd become quite a good troubleshooter, and there was lots of companies that they'd got rid of the developers. They'd managed to survive the sort of meltdown, but they didn't really have developers, and they had code that was now broken. And I was just good at. I seemed to be quite naturally good at just ferreting away and finding problems. And so I was doing that in Perl. I did a lot of that for 2 or 3 years. And so then I was just like, well, I'm making a living now. And so I just started, I ended up basically building the back end of stuff for web design agencies. They would design stuff, I'd build it. And that was really what my company did. And we eventually launched a CMS product, which we have for 10 years in PHP and MySQL. So I've sort of done a bit of being a tiny little vendor, CMS vendor, and the sort of content management world still fascinates me. But yeah, so I was doing that. I've got a daughter who, because I was pregnant with my daughter when I started all of this. She is now nearly 27. It was, it's, and by the time, but she'd sort of left home and things. I was still doing freelance work, and I was doing contract writing at that point for both Google and Mozilla. I was working on MDN as well. And this sort of opportunity came up to potentially join the team I was already working with as a contractor. And I just thought, why not? Why not try it? Why not see? Because I think, as I've become mainly a writer, that's mostly what I do. You can't scale that as a freelancer. You can't write fancier words. It's, you can only do as much work as you do. And I'd been editor in chief of Smashing Magazine and really enjoyed, the bit I enjoyed of that really was the working with new writers and being able to just, kind of mentor people as you're editing them, I thought I really like that. And so I had this sort of opportunity to sort of, be sort of heading up the writing team there at Google and just, for Chrome, and just that this is an opportunity and a Rachel shaped job that is not going to come along very often because I've got a weird set of skills. So it was like, this isn't going to come along very often. So I thought, well, why not give it a go? And so that was just over 2 years ago. And I am still there. They've coped with this person who's never been in a big company before. So
I love that. And especially because what you're describing is a combination of skills, which I find somewhat uncommon in our industry. And that is being a good writer and communicator and engineer. What kind of drove that for you? Like, how did you develop that ability to not only be a great engineer, but also good at putting thoughts on paper or virtual paper, if you will?
I always read a lot. As I say, I joke that I'm very uneducated. I've actually got 2 degrees now, but in totally non-technical subjects, because I did them for amusement. But I've always read a lot, and as a child, I read and read and read. So I think sort of that sort of the work of words is always interesting to me and always has been. But I do just love sharing stuff. I love teaching other people stuff. And I think I'm pretty good at identifying the things that are most important to talk about, because it's a lot of writers, you get stuff and they've tried to write about every single possible thing they know on a subject, and I think there's a certain skill in being able to go, these are the interesting bits, these are the bits that people need to know to be able to go and do whatever it is they're doing with this. And so I find it quite interesting to share stuff, and you learn a lot when you share things. As I said before, I often don't know what things are called because I didn't have that formal training. But as I'm writing about it, well, I'm like, oh, well, I need to say what that is. I better go find out what it is, And so I learn a lot. I learn a lot by writing, and I improve my own sort of understanding of things. So I've always found it's this sort of circular thing. I'm coding, I'm learning something, and then I'm like, oh, that's useful. Or I've just gone down this rabbit hole and got myself right in a right old mess I've had to dig myself out of. What? How could I stop someone else doing that? So yeah, it's always played, sort of, one to the other, which is good.
I find those experiences also eye-opening in terms of having a forcing function to explain to somebody that doesn't have your context. Because several occasions you start digging through some programming problem or some kind of technical implementation, and then you get to that the eureka moment, and then you kind of start tracing your steps back and like, okay, but like, if I would explain to somebody how I got here, how easy would that be? And I think that kind of is a fault of a lot of modern documentation where a lot of these assumptions are baked in. It's like, oh, you'll know what this concept is. Like, let's just glance over it and jump to a tutorial. And then like halfway through, it's like, I don't understand how any of this works. But I think like what you're describing is that skill of assessing, like, okay, how do I actually explain it to somebody that doesn't have my mental model? That is important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is as well because I didn't come through this traditional route. I've had to learn everything, and I've had to learn it sort of from scratch, and I've learned most of it by just sort of experience. Um, and I think that that is actually quite helpful, because I think if you've had a lot of stuff taught to you, you don't necessarily sort of know what you didn't know. Whereas I know what I didn't know because I hit up against the problems. So I'm like, oh, why isn't that working? Um, and so I think that's been quite helpful, in just my approach to things. I know what it is like to be completely just flummoxed at what's in front of you because you've got nothing, you know.
First-hand experience. Now, building on that, you are leading the content work on web.dev and developer.chrome.com. So arguably, I'd say like two of the most visible like web development assets in the world. Tell us more about that work. What does it entail? What's it like to be building content for such visible web experiences?
Slightly scary sometimes, I do have I have a fantastic team. So part of my role is I'm the manager of the writing team. So I've got a wonderful team of writers who sort of do an awful lot of this stuff, and also we're the writing team embedded within developer relations. So our DevRel engineers also do an awful lot of the writing, and we edit it and make sure it sort of goes out according to the style guide and help people shape things up. So yeah, it's quite varied work. We write things, but we also edit stuff, and we work with engineers to get information. And yeah, it is exciting working on something so visible. But it does mean that any little problem I hear about, people come and tell me all sorts of things. Recently we changed platforms to an internal Google platform from, we were using 11T, which there was no problem with 11T, but there's an awful lot of tooling and things that within Google that we couldn't then take advantage of because we were kind of outside on GitHub, and it was just more efficient to move things to the internal platform. But of course, you know, apart from moving thousands and thousands of pages of Markdown, which is no fun. Also, you know, you just get problems when you move. You know, we had problems with RSS feeds. We had problems, you know, there was just stuff broke. And then a lot of people, of course, notice that stuff breaks and wonder why a company as enormous as Google is having these problems. You're like, well, actually, because it's a very small team looking after this site. It's not all of Google, you know. And yeah, some stuff broke, and we're going around and fixing the things that broke. But yeah, so it's interesting. You know, there's a lot of good stuff because your stuff gets out to a massive audience, but also you do then, and any small thing is going to come back, and people are going to want to know this and that. But yeah, it's good. I think we do some good stuff, and I feel like you know, it's great to be able to sort of share this content with people, and on a site, you know, sites that are ad free, because it's really hard to do content these days. So we've got a real position of privilege that we can just publish stuff without needing to make it make money. We can publish what we think is the best thing for developers, what we would like them to know about, without having to think, oh, is this going to get the most clicks? That's not something we need to be worried about.
Your description of the work of moving thousands of Markdown files gives me flashbacks to some of the work that my team has been doing back in, I want to say like 2019 or something. We were moving a proprietary Microsoft documentation system that was powering MSDN at the time to docs.microsoft.com, which is now Learn, I guess. I haven't worked on that team for a long time, but and that was kind of the job of like, all right, there's a bunch of content stored in these weird XML files that now we need to transition to Markdown. Oh, and by the way, for all these Markdown files, we need to rename them, and that is a lot of work, but also work that is so crucial to the entire developer ecosystem, because the developers that depend on that content, like if it goes offline, it's bad. If it's out of date, it's bad. If it's incorrectly providing some API reference, it's bad. Like, it's, folks underestimate just how valuable good documentation is.
Oh yeah, I mean that's it. You know, some of the stuff that since the migration, you know, some pages just, you know, broke. You move all that Markdown, something's going to break. And you know, there's people are raising issues, going, "Oh, I really need this content, and I can't find it." You know, and this is the thing I refer back to all the time, and it would be some, you know, thing that I thought hardly anyone was looking at. You know, and so it's like it does show, you know, how much people are relying on these different things. And yeah, so yeah, it's good. And to say, I get the chance to lead a team of writers and to, you know, hopefully help them, you know, sort of, I mean, I say they're all fantastic. I think I learn as much from them as they do from me, which is great. And yeah, but it's a very nice position to be in, and I think it's let me kind of scale what I can do to some extent. In that, you know, I've sort of got other people working with me, and yeah, it's been good.
And it sounds like also documentation is important to you personally, because you're a governing member of Open Web Docs. It's not just Google, right? It's the community at large.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, so Google are a sponsor of Open Web Docs. I mean, we also contribute to MDN in other ways. I have a contractor who works on MDN to document some of the, you know, the APIs that are landing in Google. So we also contribute that way. So yeah, I mean, we don't want to have a separate documentation site. I think that it's good that there's one location for web platform documentation, and that's MDN. And so through directly contributing and also via, you know, Open Web Docs and the work they do in the community, and you know, they do a huge amount of work, not only with their own contributions, but also helping with community contributions. You know, I think we're just making that set of documentation better for everybody. And it's great that there is this kind of sort of open place for that, rather than it being, you know, a Google thing or anyone's thing. Everyone can contribute to that, which is great.
And especially because we're talking about the web ecosystem, which is by its nature, you know, it's not necessarily a walled garden. It's this giant rainforest of all sorts of things, that it's great that you're taking the approach of community-based, open, available to everyone, because that's what the web is about.
Yes, yeah, and I've got a lot of love for MDN, as have a lot of people I work with, because obviously we all use it as well. And I was also a contractor working on MDN for many years, so it's kind of I think it's great that we actually able to contribute, as I say, rather than building up a completely separate documentation set, because that would not be helpful to developers. And I think the most important thing, and the nice thing about the team I'm in, is that is something that we really care about, is how are we being the most useful to developers. As I say, if that involves contributing to MDN rather than hosting a load of stuff in a corner of our site, then that's the best thing to do.
Truly living up to the name of developer relations, because what better way to build those relations than to actually provide good services to those developers?
Yeah, I think so. That's it. And it's solving those pain points and making, because we want to make the web something that people want to be using, rather than say going and building phone apps or whatever, which is, a reasonable thing to be doing. But, we're the web people, we're the Chrome people. So we care about, that people want to use the web and that they see it as an option. So I think having good documentation and things is really important, because I think that's one of the things about other ecosystems, say like a mobile ecosystem, is they tend to have really good documentation and really good entry points. And the web's a bit kind of more all over the place, and where do you start? And so I think that's a place where documentation can help. It can give people those entry points to know what to do.
Yeah, especially, I don't know, mobile documentation, looking at you, Apple, not always the best. But I'd say, like, it's still, I don't know, to me, like, the beauty of the web is the fact that it's accessible to anybody. Like, I used to live in a third world country that had, the average income, like, you would never afford an iPhone or an Android phone, even. Like, even the most affordable options. And the web was the thing that would allow people to connect from any computer, like however old your laptop is. You can go to www.google.com and you start searching for things that are of interest to you.
Yeah, I mean that's it, and I think that's a really key thing, and sort of opening up, sort of the web to more people and more communities, and the work that we're doing. It's one of the nice things actually about the move of our platform, is that we now have all of our content more easily translated, and that's really exciting. Because we sort of assume that, oh well, if people working on the web, they must speak English because all of our documentation's in English. I mean, how privileged are we who have English? We've got so much more information, and so yeah, machine translation isn't perfect, but it's certainly better than nothing. If and having that opportunity, I think is really good.
That is wonderful. And not only are you working on documentation, but you're also a member of the kind of the web standards community. The CSS Working Group is a good example here. How has that involvement impacted your approach and your views on web development? Because you're just like as close to the kind of the definition of the web as possible.
Yeah, so I mean, this all really came about because of my writing. And a while ago, when CSS grid layout was really not a thing anyone was talking about, I happened to see a sort of early presentation on the idea. And I was like, that is what we need, and I'm not letting it go away. And so I kind of started this sort of mission as like this unfunded DevRel of CSS Grid, because I was absolutely determined that people would know about it, because I knew that if people knew about it, people would start asking about it and they'd want it. And so yeah, I just started like going to conferences and talking about this thing that didn't really exist yet, and then it sort of existed in IE in a very early state, and yeah, and so it was through that work that I was invited to be an invited expert. Because obviously I was independent, I wasn't part of a big company, so they sort of invited me as an invited expert. And then obviously I've now been involved for several years, and now obviously I represent Google because I'm part of Google on the CSS Working Group. And edit specs, which, yeah, if you talk about imposter syndrome, the CSS Working Group is the place for the biggest imposter syndrome, because these people are just super bright, and I'm just like crashing around trying to contribute, and I think what I bring is that developer sort of focus, and I think when I first was an invited expert, there were very few actual web developers involved. So there was lots of people who were browser engineers, who were spec writers, who knew all about this stuff, but didn't really ever build a website. Certainly not, for clients, and and so I think that was really what I was initially doing, was just sort of going, well, as a web developer, and also as a teacher of this stuff, I think, I've often got a lot to offer in terms of, this would be hard to teach. If we go this route with this spec, it's going to be really, really hard to explain to people. And that's actually, when you're making those decisions, that's actually a really useful thing to know. So yeah, I mean, when I'm working on anything, I'm working on something at the moment, and I just started writing down how I would teach it, to try and figure it out. I started making examples that obviously don't work yet, because it doesn't exist. But I'm just figuring out how I would explain it to somebody else, because if I can do that, then it's probably got reasonable ergonomics for developers, and then I can sort of see how that then works.
I really, really like that approach. And I think that after this podcast, I am going to take this to my team, and especially because we design a different class of APIs. My team works on like the security side of the house, but this is such a wonderful perspective of how would I explain this to somebody else? Because so often we as engineers think of things like, oh, yeah, this API makes sense. Put it in there. Oh, yeah, we need to add this other API concept. Just put it in there. But the moment you ask yourself that question, it's like, well, how would I explain it to somebody that doesn't know this yet? And then you start kind of figuring out, like, oh yeah, that's kind of a weird choice. Like, why would we do this?
Yeah, it's very, write the tutorial first. It's really interesting thinking of how you would teach something, because then it kind of shows it as the clunky things and the stuff that seems not logical, and the names for things that don't make sense. Because the minute you kind of put them in a tutorial, or you think about presenting it at a conference, you know, you're like, yeah, that just seems weird. That sounds back to front. That doesn't, or that sounds like something else. That sounds like it would do something different. Um, and it's really only when you speak these things or write these things down and try and teach them that you realize that. And so I think that's what I lack in formal background. I think I bring that aspect to the work there, is that I can think about how I would explain it to someone.
And on the topic of writing, so you were the editor in chief for Smashing Magazine, which in my eyes, it's like, this is a huge achievement. Like I remember reading your article in Smashing Magazine, like, and I believe it was like 2012 or something like that. And so a long, long time ago. And you not only have published content on blogs and Smashing Magazine, but also you wrote books. So titles like HTML5 for designers, the new CSS layout, get ready for CSS grid layout, what we were just talking about. What inspires you to write kind of evergreen content? Because on the kind of the developer scene, you have folks that come in and it's like, oh, I maintain a blog. They write for the blog. They write some articles on dev.to. Not a lot of folks say, you know what, I'm going to sit down and write a book, because in kind of my understanding is like sitting down and writing a book, it's a whole different class of commitment. Like there's a lot of work involved there.
It is a whole thing, yes. And I think a lot of people who are good writers really struggle once they try and write a book, because it is a different thing. I'm also a runner, and it's a bit like, like running a 10K or even running a half marathon. Like a marathon is not like two half marathons, you know. That second half marathon is very, very different to the first, And I think writing a book's a bit like that. It is just a set of articles put together in terms of length, but it's very different. And I think so. Yeah, and when I started, books were really the main thing. Most people learned from books. I think that's very different now, and there's a lot of people who don't really have a lot of books. But that was the thing, and so writing books, it kind of came about. I actually wrote an article for Macromedia, as was on their sort of developer site, and a publisher saw it and said, "Well, would you write a couple of chapters of a book?" And I mean, this was, I don't know, 2000, 2001, something like that, and I just thought this was hilarious because, as I say, I left school at 16. But I thought, well, it's only a couple of chapters. If they hate it, they'll find someone else to do it. So I wrote that, and then they asked me to write other things. And I ended up writing a book called the CSS Anthology, which went to 4 editions. And that book was incredibly successful in tech book terms. I still have people bringing like dog-eared copies of it to conferences and asking me to sign it, which I think is just amazing. I mean, that's, when people come and say, "Oh, this was the book I learned CSS from," and now I've got this career and I'm doing this, and I mean, that's just an amazing thing, and I love it that people come and tell me that, because that is, you do this stuff and you think it's quite good and you get paid for it, and that's all right, and but to sort of hear that you've actually had some small influence in someone else's career and path to doing what they enjoy doing is amazing. And so, yeah, I like thinking in long form. I'm always telling people to write shorter blog posts, because but I enjoy writing long things, and I enjoy the process of structuring and thinking through how that's going to work. I mean, just like I like writing like an hour-long conference talk and just figuring out the arc of that. Books are a bit like that. It's figuring out how to shape that up and shape that narrative that is going to make sense and take people through the sort of things they need to learn, rather than articles and blog posts, which tend to be a little bit more sort of piecemeal. It's like, I need to do this one little thing now, and here it is.
I think it goes a little counter to the ever shortening attention span trend, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, I don't think anything replaces a good book.
And I don't get that many books, but in like learning Python, I've picked up some books because sort of, actually I do want to kind of follow through some projects, and because I think it is useful, particularly when you start learning something. It can be useful just to build along with someone, and learn and get into to pick up their wisdom as you go, on how they would do it. So I think there is a place for that kind of content, and then for a lot of people, it's going to be video tutorials. They would prefer to. I prefer to read, definitely, but I know for a lot of people, watching someone code and things is better. And I think that's just another format like that.
An excellent perspective. Rachel, there's a lot of gems in this show, but I want to wrap up this episode by asking one last question that I ask of all my guests. And that is, if you think back through your career, your work, your experience, if you'd give one piece of unconventional advice to somebody that is listening to this and thinks, wow, I want to do what Rachel does, what would that be?
I don't know that it's unconventional, but I think for me it is just the fact that if you found out something, if you've done something that you found interesting in your day, in your work day, and it doesn't matter how junior you are and whether you are just learning to code right now, you will know things. You'll have found things out, you'll have stumbled over stuff that will be useful to somebody else. And, start there, because writing down what you're doing or sharing it as YouTube shorts or whatever it is that you're doing, however, there's lots of different ways to share content these days when I started. But just that act of saying, I learned a cool thing, it might be useful to someone else, here it is, this is what I did. I mean, don't worry that 100 other people have taught similar things, because you've got your own sort of take on it, and someone will find that useful. And I think, and in the process of sharing, you'll learn a lot more yourself as well, and you'll learn like the next thing you want to explore.
I'd say this is very unconventional and very valuable. Rachel, thank you so much. It's been a delight chatting with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun.